This video is brought to you by DC20, the wonderfully innovative new TTRPG system whose Kickstarter is live now. DC20 is an evolution in fantasy TTRPGs. It brings rules that are fun and intuitive while still feeling fresh and familiar, with gameplay that's designed to be smooth while also being full of dynamic choices that keep players engaged and encourage teamwork. DC20's rules allow for open-ended creativity that doesn't get in the way of your story or incredibly customizable character creation. Combat is flexible and engaging and rewards your high rolls. Yes, they actually matter. Back the project in the first 72 hours and you'll get a ton of bonus content for free, like the DC20 One-Shot Collection PDF, full of one-shots that you can just jump into right away, and the DC20 Magic Item Collection to reward your players with fun and epic loot, and also the DC20 Advanced Guide Collection that gives tips and tricks to both new and advanced players and GMs. All backers will also get free beta access immediately when the Kickstarter ends, a free monster starter pack, a free PDF with the hardcover, and the lowest price for the game that you're ever gonna see. So what are you waiting for? Go back DC20 on Kickstarter now using my link in the description and the pinned comments below. The DC20 RPG from the Dungeon Coach has been in development for quite some time now in alpha state. However, with the launch of the Kickstarter today, if you're seeing this on the day that this video goes up, it will be moved into beta. So I thought this marks the best time to go over many of the core mechanics of the game to give everyone an idea of what DC20 is all about, and I promise, it is so worth it. We aren't going to waste any time here, let's just get going. If you've played Dungeons & Dragons, so much of this will feel familiar to you. The fundamentals of the game translate very well from 5e, and while there is a lot more going on and there is a lot more nuance, nothing should be too confusing for anyone coming to the game with little or even no TTRPG experience, but this is especially true for a D&D player. Starting off with attributes, which is what D&D refers to as abilities. There are 4 attributes in DC20: Might, Agility, Intelligence, and Charisma. This has been streamlined down from the 6 that you see in many other games, and I truly feel like nothing has been lost here. Everything has been neatly incorporated into the 4 attributes, and into what they refer to as your prime modifier, which is one of the best aspects of the game, but we'll get there soon. Might is exactly what you think it is. It represents your strength. Agility is your balance, nimbleness, and dexterity. Intelligence represents your reasoning, understanding, but also your wisdom. A noteworthy distinction from other games where there's very commonly a distinct split between intelligence and wisdom. Finally, there's Charisma, which comprises your charm, presence, persuasiveness, and even your force of will. Each of these has also been further subdivided into various skills like athletics, trickery, investigation, influence, and insight, among many others. What's important to note here, and you may have noticed, is that none of these abilities on their own represent your capacity to attack with a weapon or to cast spells. This is where the prime modifier comes into play. When you create your character, you get to assign your attribute scores. The game provides different methods for doing so, including a standard array, point buy, and even for rolling. We're just going to use the standard array here since it's the simplest. With the standard array, you get to assign a 3, 1, 0, and -2 to each of your abilities. The thing is though, that you don't need to worry that if you picked a barbarian that you need to drop your 3 into might by default, or that if you picked a wizard that you need to put it into intelligence. This is not the case. In DC20, whichever ability is your highest, so at level 1, whichever ability you assign your 3 to becomes your prime modifier. This is then what is used to determine a number of things, but mainly your attack and spell checks. What this means is that you can have a barbarian with high intelligence and it won't negatively impact your ability to attack. You can represent this as your cunning and tactical mind that perfectly understands the flow and pace of combat or knows just exactly where to strike. You can be a physically strong wizard that uses their sheer force and strength to channel the essence of magic into the world. The inclusion of the prime modifier allows you to truly make the character that you want to make without feeling as though you're intentionally hampering your abilities by doing so. This is an excellent inclusion in the game. Next, I want to touch on the skill system, but particularly the masteries, which is the functional equivalent of proficiencies in D&D. There are 4 different types of masteries in the game: skill, trade, language, and combat. Trade masteries are kind of like tools in D&D, and combat mastery is related to all things battle like attack and spell checks and even your defenses. We're going to look at skill mastery since it's largely the same principle for all of them, except where it isn't, I guess. Anyway, in order to obtain a skill mastery, you need to spend a skill point. Skill points are obtained through class and subclass features, through your ancestries, and even through talents. Essentially, you will regularly earn more as you level up throughout your adventuring career. Each skill point that you place into a skill grants you a mastery level in it. Each mastery is worth a +2 bonus to that skill. There are 5 mastery levels: Novice, Adept, Expert, Master, and Grandmaster. Now, say you have 5 skill points. You can't just place them all in one skill and get a +10 as a Grandmaster at level 1 or something. Your mastery level has a limit determined by your character level. Novice from 1 to 4, Adept from 5 to 9, Expert from 10 to 14, Master from 15 to 19, and Grandmaster at 20. However, you are able to surpass this cap when you obtain an Expertise. If a feature or something else that you gain gives you an expertise in a skill, you're able to break the limit of your mastery level, though the maximum can only go to +16, which is 3 levels above Grandmaster. The reason I wanted to discuss this is because it really is an elegant system. It seems a bit odd at first glance, particularly with the expertise, but once you've read it, it just makes so much sense. As much as I do enjoy the proficiency system in D&D as is, there's something about this that just feels nice. Because of the mastery level limit, most checks will be contained, but expertise allows the player the agency to break that rule, power up a skill a bit, but it doesn't get insanely high. I'm a big fan of this system. Trade masteries work exactly the same way. Language masteries are a bit different, but we're not really going to spend time on that. What is worth noting, though, is that skill points can actually be converted, which allows for even more flexibility in creating your character. 1 skill point can be converted into 1 trait point, and 1 trait point can be converted into 2 language points. Alternatively, you could just do 1 skill point into 2 language points, though it's worth noting that they cannot be converted the other way. Combat Mastery works a little bit differently in that its value is always equal to 1/2 of your level rounded up. You can use your Combat Mastery for things like making attacks, saves, spell checks, and it can also influence your defense. For example, when you make an attack check, you roll a d20 plus your prime modifier plus Combat Mastery to determine the result. We'll talk a little bit more about attack and defense in the combat section though. One final note on skills is that degrees of success or failure are a built-in and core rule of the game. For those unfamiliar with how degrees of success or failure work, essentially it allows for your success or failure to become greater depending on how well or poorly you rolled on a check. Say for example, the DC for an athletics check is 10. If you roll a 10, you obviously succeed. But if you roll a 15, you might be able to jump farther or have a softer landing without disturbing the guards watching the area. Or maybe you roll a 5 and then you fall and also land badly and potentially take some damage. The idea here is that there's a sliding scale of how good or bad your checks can be. In the game, you'll see success, success each 5, and success 5 or 10. In this case, success obviously indicates what happens on a successful check. A success each 5 would indicate the bonus for each 5 that you surpass the check by. The text uses the example of a spell that pushes a creature back, where with each 5 that you surpass the DC by, you get to push the creature an additional space. Lastly, success 5 or 10 represent different bonuses that can happen depending on how much you surpass the DC of the check by. This same system also applies to failures. Alright, so let's talk about combat. In DC 20, you get 4 action points to spend every round, and you gain them all back at the end of your turn. You can spend an action point on just about anything that you would normally expect to be able to. You can spend a point to move up to your speed, or to make an attack roll, or to cast spells, or importantly, to also take your reactions. Your action points essentially determine what you can or can't do during a round. An interesting twist though is that there is nothing stopping you from making, say, 4 attacks on one single turn. However, the game has thought of that, and there is something called the multiple check penalty. So, say you spend your first action point to make an attack. You can then spend your second action point to also make an attack. However, that one is made at disadvantage. Disadvantage here is the same as it is in 5e in that you roll 2 d20s and choose the lower results, and it's the inverse for advantage. Then, say you wanted to use your third point to make another attack. You can do that too, but it's at double disadvantage. So you're rolling 3 dice and choosing the lowest, and you can do the same with your fourth action point, and yes, you guessed it, triple disadvantage. Roll 4 dice, choose the lowest. This is honestly a very refreshing system, as it's so wide open and allows you so much flexibility if you're willing to risk it, or if you have ways of surpassing disadvantage or gaining high modifiers on rolls. It also means that you're sacrificing other things that you could potentially be doing with your turn without disadvantage. It's worth noting here that you can also always spend an action point to gain advantage on a roll. So say you're on your second attack, but you don't want to make it a disadvantage. You can then use your third action point to give yourself advantage on the second attack, which then makes them cancel out, so it's just a straight roll. One note on stacking advantage and disadvantage is that one instance of either does not necessarily cancel out all other instances as it does in 5e. Here, if you have 2 sources of advantage and 1 of disadvantage, you still have advantage on the roll. If you have 3 sources of advantage and 1 disadvantage, you then get double advantage. The game represents this by showing things like advantage 2 or disadvantage 3. So we've talked about making attacks, but what about your defenses? DC 20 has 2 types of defense, physical and mystical. Physical defense is your difficulty at being hit with, well, physical things like weapons, but also elemental damage like fire and lightning. Your physical defense is calculated as 8 plus combat mastery plus armor bonus if you're wearing any. Your mystical defense is your ability to not get hit from supernatural sources of damage like psychic or radiant damage. It's calculated as 8 plus combat mastery plus charisma plus intelligence. I love this split, as the 2 sources of damage are so fundamentally different, it just feels like it makes sense that you would have different defensive capabilities for either one. You can also choose how to focus on one over the other, and also just because you don't necessarily focus on intelligence, for example, it doesn't mean that your mystical defense is then going to be in the gutter, since it still gains the benefit of your combat mastery, which, as a reminder, is always half of your level rounded up, plus your charisma. So we now know how attacking and defending works, but what about damage? Well, in DC 20, you don't roll for damage. Now, this might sound less fun and a little bit jarring, but counterpoint, it isn't. Damage rolling is one of the most inherently swinging moments in a TTRPG. It can feel amazing to roll well, but awful to roll terribly. And that can absolutely appeal to a certain type of player. But that's why here, instead of rolling for damage, every weapon has a flat damage value, but this value can be increased by various abilities or features, or most interestingly, by rolling well against the target's defense. You know how in D&D when you can roll like a 27 against something's AC of 15, but then you roll like a 3 for damage? Yeah, here you actually get rewarded for rolling well above the target's defense at certain thresholds. If you roll a 5 above the target's defense, that's considered a heavy hit and you get +1 damage. If you roll 10 above, it's a brutal hit and you get an additional +1 damage. More importantly though, heavy and brutal hits also bypass damage reduction a creature might have, like resistance to your weapon's damage type. So not only do you deal extra damage, but you also get to deal the full damage. Critical hits are on a natural 20 and also always deal +2 damage. So while you aren't rolling damage, you're also not just throwing a static number out each time. That would be boring. It's much more dynamic than that, which is awesome to see. Next, I want to talk about another of my favorite DC 20 mechanics, and those are the rules for death and dying. In 5e, these rules are famously controversial, as the game provides little incentive to worry very much about death at all, to be frank. Characters that are low on health are functionally identical to those at max hit points, and there's no downside to constantly falling unconscious and being immediately revived. Enter Death's Door. Death's Door is DC 20's implementation of the death and dying rules. The way that it works is, you have a death threshold which is equal to 0 minus your prime modifier. So at first level, it's very likely that your prime modifier will be 3, therefore your death threshold is -3. As a result, if something ever takes you to -3 health, you die instantly. Your death threshold will naturally increase as you level up, which symbolizes your character's growing resilience. Now, when you fall to 0 health or below, you're on Death's Door. When in this position, you immediately gain 1 level of exhaustion. This gives you a cumulative penalty to all checks and saves and decreases your speed and save DC for each level of exhaustion that you have. Additionally though, you can still take actions, however your action point limit is now capped at 1 instead of 4, and you can no longer concentrate on spells. Finally, at the end of your turn, you make a death save. On a failed save, you take 1 true damage. True damage is a type of damage in the game that cannot be mitigated in any way at all. This then marches you 1 step closer to your death threshold and potentially death. The death save itself is the same as in D&D. On a 1 to 9 you fail, on a 10 to 20 you succeed. On a critical failure though, you fall unconscious, and on a critical success, you are rebounded to 1 hit point. I'm a big fan of this system, as it not only disincentivizes you from dying and healing constantly, what's dubbed as the yo-yo in 5e, but it also disincentivizes you from even having low health, which as a result makes healing feel more meaningful in the game and instead of something that you just kind of do after someone goes down. Being low on health, especially at low levels, puts you incredibly close to being instantly killed by a single hit, so that threat feels very real and tangible. Alright, let's talk about spellcasting now. There's a lot of nuance and detail here, so we'll keep things fairly high level. When you cast a spell, you make a spell check. To make a spell check, you roll a d20 plus your prime modifier plus your combat mastery. As a reminder, this allows you to be a spellcaster without needing to focus on any one ability in particular. When you cast a spell, there are multiple different things that it can target depending on what the spell text says. The spell check can either target the creature's physical or mystical defense, or it could be against the spell's own internal DC. Fire Shield, for example, requires a DC 15 spell check to successfully cast. Or the spell check could be against a creature save, which is also listed in the spell text. Most spells cost at least 2 action points to cast, though some, like cantrips, cost 1, and other, more powerful spells can cost 3 or even more action points. Additionally, some spells will also require the caster to spend a certain amount of mana points on them. This is typically reserved for more powerful spells, and is essentially the replacement for spell slots. So about that, there are no spell slots in DC20. You are limited by the amount of mana points and action points that you currently have. You do have a mana spend point limit though, and that is that you can only spend an amount of mana points on one spell equal to your combat mastery, and you regain your mana only after a long rest. Let's look at a few examples. Firebolt is a cantrip. It requires 1 action point to cast. It's got a range of 10 spaces and allows you to do one of 2 things. You can make a spell check against the target's special defense, and on a hit they take 2 fire damage. Or you can choose to make it a fire orb instead, so rather than dealing damage, it creates a flame in your hand that gives off bright light. And if you wanted to, you could opt to spend another action point at any time to shoot the orb as if it were the spell attack. This already just shows how interesting and flexible spellcasting is in DC20, and this is just a cantrip. You don't need 2 different spells, one can do the job of both, and it really lends itself to the idea of the caster wielding this fire in a natural way, but it gets cooler. Firebolt also has a passive effect that just deals an additional fire damage to creatures that are already burning. Burning is a status condition in the game that causes affected creatures to take 1 fire damage at the start of their turn. And we still aren't done. You can even opt to power up your Firebolt by spending additional action points on it. You can spend additional points to choose to deal an additional damage, or increase the range by 5 spaces, or potentially cause the target to start burning. Or you can spend a total of 4 action points on Firebolt and do all of these things at the same time if you really wanted to. I'm not sure how good that is, but it's just so cool that you can. Burning Flames is another spell, this time not a cantrip. It costs 2 action points and 1 mana point to cast. The range is 10 spaces and its point of origin is at the caster. When you cast it, you can choose the type of area that the spell will have, either a line, cone, or sphere. Already, again, so cool, so flexible. On a hit against the target's physical defense, they take 2 fire damage, and just like with Firebolt, you can empower it, but this time with mana points. Spending an additional mana point can force all targets in the area to need to make a save against the burning condition, or you can spend a mana point to change the spell's point of origin to somewhere else within 15 spaces. This is just so cool. You don't need to have hundreds and hundreds of spells when you can do so much with the spells that you already have. This also just makes everyone's life at the table easier and makes choosing new spells a much more fun and less daunting experience. And that moment when you describe to the table what you're about to do as you empower your spell just sounds so epic. Another really cool thing that you can do is combo spellcasting. If you and another character within 5 spaces of you that also knows the same spell, and you share the same spot in the initiative order, you can both contribute mana together to empower a spell, which is just awesome. There's so much more to go over with spellcasting, but the last thing that I want to talk about are spell duels. There is no counterspell in DC20, strictly speaking at least. Instead, whenever someone is casting a spell, anyone can opt to spend 2 action points as a reaction and spend at least 1 mana point to initiate a spell duel against the original caster. To duel, they choose a spell that they know and describe how it is countering the targeted spell. This is mostly for flavor though. They then make a contested spell check with each other, and the highest check wins. You can influence the result of your spell check by spending more mana on it up to your spend limit, or by having other characters join the spell duel as well. When this happens, everyone makes their own spell check, and the highest result rolled is the one chosen for the duel, though all action and mana points are still spent. It's worth noting that the original caster can also have their team members empower the spell duel as well. If you successfully win your duel that you're trying to counter, the spell fails. If you don't, then the spell takes effect as normal. If the result is a tie, the spell still fails, but then you roll on the Wild Surge magic table. I just think this is so dope. The flavor of spell duels is something that I've always thought about, and I think is such a fun and interesting and dynamic element to add to the game. There is just so much more to discuss about DC20. We have barely scratched the surface here. We haven't even looked at classes or ancestries, weapon styles, talents, stamina, and just so much more. But hopefully this has given you a good understanding of the core fundamentals of the game, which, by the way, is live on Kickstarter right now, so be sure to use my link in the description or the pinned comment to go support the Dungeon Coach and the game right now. I will be making a lot more DC20 content in the coming weeks and months. I know this has been something that a lot of you have been requesting anyway, and now definitely just feels like the right time. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Remember, go support DC20 on Kickstarter right now, check out some of my other videos, but otherwise, take care.